Excellent. Must be the right time to start, Dustin, because our computers both dinged at the same time. Really
Right.
happy to have everyone. It's great to have you on the Legal Lunch Bite today, Dustin. We've been friends for 3 or 4 years at least. We share a lot of interests in languages we speak and places we've lived. Really, really happy to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, likewise, very happy to be here. I appreciate the invite. For us, it seems the topic's going to be interesting to your listeners, but I think for us, it's a pretty normal conversation. So this should be
Yeah,
fun.
but also very interesting because I know how your brain works, and I know your expertise is very complementary to mine. So it's really fun to hear your perspective, what you've been reading and what you've been seeing. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, you and I most recently were in Southeast Asia together last summer, visiting several countries. I know you had a job switch since then, but let's back up to what took you to Asia and a career there.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. So I actually started my career in China, and I went to China before I'd even graduated school. So I took Chinese, just kind of spur of the moment decision back in 2008, 2009. I took a gap year from high school, and I just dated myself, of course. But I saw what was happening in the world, right? I had always been super interested in international relations and history, and I saw the way the winds were blowing. It's not exactly expert analysis at that time to see that China is becoming more and more important. So I decided to study Chinese. I had no real connection to the culture or the country, but I'd always been interested in Asia, and got to go over there throughout my college years. But right when I was about to graduate from Columbia, like I had one semester left, I got an opportunity to do a summer internship there, and that summer internship was with a firm called DSA, or Desenchir and Associates, that may be familiar to some listeners. And that summer internship turned into a job, essentially, because I got to do some really great things. So that's what brought me to Asia. I came back just to finish my degree and got back over there as soon as I could. And I just fell in love with the dynamism, the fast-paced nature of the business climate there. I got to see not only China, but Southeast Asia, and how that was becoming more and more important, and kind of more of a prime moment to get involved in that region, as opposed to China coming in as a young professional expat at a time when it was already quite saturated and things had started to slow down. So, that's kind of what brought me to this whole world, this sphere, so to speak. And I'm lucky that, I came back to the United States from Asia in 2018. And I'm lucky that since then, whether it's been, and I think we'll talk about this more, but whether it's been at the World Trade Center, Utah, which was my former employer, where I got to head up our global business services team and help Utah companies with their international expansion or supply chain needs at a very high level, right? Or in my current role as head of product and supply chain for a beauty company here in Salt Lake called Borboletta. We're a leader in the lash extension, lash and eye care space. I've gotten to apply my background in Asia and my experience and some of my contacts, frankly, to stay involved, but I get to see it from a lot of different sides, right? So I've had the consultant thing, I've had the consultant, slash quasi public sector thing going on. And then now I get total brand side, private. So it's been really great.
Yeah, such an interesting transition. So let's, China's fallen out of vogue somewhat in the past 5-6 years, right? It was even before President Trump got elected, the trade war got started. There was always a lot of rocky things in the relationship that a lot of people wanted to gloss over anyway. So let's focus on Southeast Asia, because we could talk all day, but we really only have about 10 more minutes, and we want to keep this digestible for everyone. So let's contrast China to Southeast Asia. What are the differences that you saw between China, working in China, and of Southeast Asia more generally?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And because we don't, I wish we had more time, but Southeast Asia is not a monolith, right? There's a lot of diversity within the region. You got Singapore, and then you've got Cambodia, right? Totally different levels of development. Nothing against Cambodia, of course. But what I felt, I went to Vietnam first, and then Singapore, Indonesia. So a lot of diversity, but generally speaking, among the big developing economies. So Indonesia, Vietnam, lesser extent Philippines, even Thailand at times, and Malaysia, even though they're more developed. I would say that those countries have kind of the dynamism I felt in China in the late aughts, the late 2000s, but more laid back. The culture is much more laid back. More they've got that interest in the outside world. And embracing, foreign ideas. And from a business perspective, again, there's a lot of diversity, but there's a boom, but it doesn't feel out of control. But there are some things that are very similar for people experienced with China. So Vietnam last year, the end of last year, and then into this year has had some major real estate market issues that are quasi-political as well, which are affecting the entire economy. So that is something which could easily exist in China. But the thing that hit me right away going to Vietnam was just, you can use Google at that time. You could use Facebook. You still can, right? But there's an openness that, even being a one-party dictatorship in Vietnam specifically, it still feels a little less stifled. So it's a little looser, which is great. So there's a lot of things going for it, and it's an exciting region. And I'm just kind of lucky with the time that I first got exposed to it.
I just came across a term recently called benevolent dictatorship. And I thought that's kind of how I felt what Vietnam is doing, what Singapore is doing a bit, right? It's,
definitely Singapore. Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk about something a little more technical then. So China plus one is the strategy. I often describe myself as a China plus one lawyer, and then I have to explain to people what that really means. With the supply chain moving, still being largely based in China, but then shifting a bit to other countries based on companies wanting to diversify their supply chain risk.
Right.
So we know that, especially with the U.S. And to a large extent the EU now, China is struggling to keep its friends in the same place, right? China trying to keep its friends as close as possible, but I don't know how well it's working. What do you see from your perspective in terms of China's success in keeping manufacturing centered there, or how much is draining out to Southeast Asia and other places?
Yeah, it's a great question. We heard China plus one a lot in the common parlance a few years back, prior to COVID, trade war, and then right after COVID as well. Not that it's diminished interest in it, I don't think, but I don't hear it to the same degree as I used to. And I think it's become just kind of a new normal. It's not a new idea anymore, right? You kind of have to do it. A lot of companies have had to look at over the last few years, moving away from China, not 100%, right? But maybe 70%, 60%, 50%, and so on, and looking to supplement it with one country. The issue though, and I just kind of made this mistake myself, the issue I've always had with that term, it's not really plus one, in my opinion. It's China and then many others. There's a basket of countries. And especially if you are going to try to replace a large degree of your China business, over 50% of what you sourced, for instance, you can't just have one country do it. No country is going to be able to fill that void. It's usually a collection. But in terms of China keeping investment, they don't want to keep everything, or I should rather say they didn't want to keep everything. I recall when I was in Vietnam, there were some activities, especially in more developed coastal areas of China. It was pretty clear the local government kind of wanted some of those activities, polluting activities, to go. And it was becoming more difficult. But they want to keep some things for sure. And I think they've lost a little more in those higher value add areas than they maybe would have liked to. But a lot of US companies, accepting those industries that have strategic importance. So what we've seen with chips and all that, but for consumer goods, for more less controversial products, let's say, a lot of companies are going to find it really, really hard to completely decouple from China. So while I've seen the investment side, really, generally get hurt. The sourcing side, to a much lesser degree, because China still makes it so convenient, so easy to source compared with Vietnam or Indonesia, for instance, which I'm sure you see all the time with your clients as well. That it's hard to beat them on price and quality, especially for a small and medium sized company. So I'd say China's been moderately successful, to answer your question. But it's not necessarily because of what they've done. It's more just the dynamics of the economy regionally, and the fact that they've created this industrial powerhouse that no one country can really match. India's trying, I know, but it's going to be difficult for a US SME to realistically decouple, let's say, from China.
Yeah. What does Borboletta's supply chain look like right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're interesting in that we have over 600 SKUs, and that's the nature of the lash business, as I've learned. Not that surprise, I didn't know a ton about the lash business when I first came here. It's not a lifelong passion of mine, but I've grown to really love it, by the way. So our supply chain, we source mostly from East Asia, which is nice for me and my background. So a lot from Korea, a lot from China, a lot from Vietnam. Looking at countries like Indonesia, we source some from the EU as well, and then a lot of here made in the United States. So because we have so many SKUs and Borboletta, like availability along with quality and culture / community, that's a core value of the company. So that's a lot of the times on me and my team to make sure the products are in stock, and having over 600 SKUs, that's hard to do. But I would say that, I was surprised how hard it was for me to justify moving a lot of products away from China when I came in and looked at what we did, right? I would say a lot of our Chinese suppliers are wonderful to work with. And sometimes even with tariffs, even if there's a 25% punitive tariff, it still might not make sense in every situation. So yeah, it's an interesting, complex supply chain to run, and it's fun to apply what I've seen on the outside as the consultant for a long time here with one firm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So let's dive back into the concept of Southeast Asia not being a monolith. I mean, aside from language, geography, governance structures, what do you see as some of the strengths and weaknesses of the countries that we hear about? I mean, top of mind for me is countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, the countries that really have a huge population base, a lower, not as advanced as China, let's say. So their labor costs are going to be lower, which is something, one reason why a lot of companies are looking to move things out of China as well. What do you see, just kind of top of mind, some of the some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses in the various markets in Southeast Asia?
It's a great question and a really important point. It's not a monolith. So Indonesia, I love Indonesia. It's a great country to visit. It can be a very good country to manufacture and do business in. It's always, I think, punched a little under its weight in terms of capacity, never quite reached the full potential. Indonesia does really, really well, obviously, putting aside natural resources, though, in garments, textiles, in shoes. They are big in my industry, actually, in lashes, which I came to learn about. They are relatively cost competitive, but there are some cultural issues and quirks, idiosyncrasies that can be very lovely, but can also make doing business there, especially if you're used to China, where everything's very fast paced, sometimes feel challenging. Vietnam is what I would call like a middle of the road generalist, which does pretty well on everything. That everything that you would normally source from Southeast Asia. Now they're trying to move up the value chain. It's kind of like a mini China in that regard 15 years ago. But they do great in garments, light manufacturing, consumer goods. They're getting into steel. So anybody familiar with China would recognize a lot in Vietnam. Malaysia is going to be good for electronics, some higher value add activities. Thailand's going to be great for automotive. It has a huge automotive sector, electronics again, but in and around Bangkok, wages can be high. Everywhere else in the country, wages are lower. And the Philippines too. The Philippines has a lot to offer. I was talking with a company that makes bags and backpacks there the other day. You can find a great deal in the Philippines if you're willing to look. But again, it's just not so easy to find the right local partner or to understand the way their different economic zone incentives work. So it's a varied bunch. But what I would say is, for sort of your first stop, I think Vietnam often makes a lot of sense if you're a mix of labor intensive and you have China-centric supply chains that you're trying to move away from, because it's more easily integrated with existing China supply. So if you've got inputs coming in, it's convenient for that.
That's great, Dustin. Well, we're at time. 15 minutes goes quickly, and when we're trying to jump all over Southeast Asia, it's been excellent to have you, though. Thanks. Really appreciate you sharing your perspective. Fun to hear about what Borboletta is doing, and certainly looking forward to talking again in the future.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate it.